Lois was wondering why it was I picked just a couple of verses. And I know he grew up in Event, so I wanted to go easy on him. But no, this is one of those topics, and I've got to think of them more that I've done these topics as reminders, reiterations of something we studied in our Wednesday night Bible class to some great depth. I don't want to get into things in depth. I want to do a real shallow overview of some of the topics, but to me, it's a great reminder of where we stand with the Bible. And the difficulty in some of these topics, as you've noticed, is the Bible does not address them in some direct fashion with the terminology we use today. I mean, very often when you talk about the concept of a dance, the meaning we use today in our culture is so different than that which we find in the Bible. And I've chosen two examples to illustrate that. In fact, two examples on opposing ends of the spectrum as they are used. Dance is a very different thing in our culture, and what I'm going to do is present to you these two opposing dichotomous kind of events, and then let you look at them and say, okay, which one matches best to what we see today in our culture when someone talks about the modern dance. And so I'm going to look at the Old Testament first. In 2 Samuel, if you're in your Bibles, in that verse, the text states that David danced before the Lord. Now, to begin with, as we kind of dissect some of this, I want to keep in the back of our mind that there are a lot of people who want to defend many of the cultural anomalies, if you will, in our day and time that are entertainments, I guess you would say, things about which people go and entertain themselves. They practice, they do them as a social bonding situation. And when you look at exactly what they're doing, you're hard put to find in the Bible where this is mentioned, let alone approved. Well, in this particular case, when somebody starts talking about the dance and saying, why, they danced in the Old Testament, and I can't even remember how many times I have had this discussion about dancing with someone and had them mention David. As a matter of fact, I don't know whether you're familiar with Hollywood's rendition of David dancing. I think Richard Gere was the actor that perverted it terribly. Well, it was the Hollywood directors and writers that made a perversion out of it. But their depiction of it was so vulgar and so worldly, it made you wonder, what Bible did they read to get that rendition of what David supposedly had done? But when you look at this, I want you to note that David danced before the Lord. Now, there are several things featured here about what David did. He did this before the Lord. This was a form of worship to God. This was a form of gratitude for the return of the ark. And by the way, if you read the context, we won't go into it. This incident of bringing the ark back and putting it near, the city of David, Jerusalem, didn't go well to start with because he didn't get priests to carry the ark. He had the ark put on a cart, and they're going down the road. This oxen stumbled was the terminology used in the Bible. As one of the guys put the hand up to stop the ark from falling off, he dropped dead. And it's interesting to me that when the anger of the Lord was aroused in chapter 6, verse 7, he against Uzzah, and God struck him there in his error, and he died. David's response in verse 8 was he became angry because of the Lord's outburst. Well, you did things wrong, what do you expect? And that's odd coming from David. So when we look at the idea of David trying to do something good, at least in his mind, but doing it the wrong way, it was not accepted by God. And so when David got his act together and they began to carry it like they were supposed to, as the text kind of gives us an indicator happened, then they were able to bring the ark back, and there was great rejoicing in that event. Now, David, when he was dancing before the Lord. It was worship. He did so with all his might. He was wearing a linen ephod. An ephod was a sacred kind of thing that they used in their worship assembly. So you can look at this event and understand that the dancing that was going on here was worship to God. My question is, in the modern dance, is there any connection there? Well, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I don't know of two things that would be even further apart from that. Now, one of the things that happened that helps us understand what went on during the dance was his wife, Michael, her response to it. And her response was very sarcastic in verse 20. How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maidservants as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Evidently, during this dance, David was not fully clothed, as one might be normally, but was wearing linen, which is very thin cloth. But nevertheless, what David's response to her was in verse 22, I didn't do this as a matter of lasciviousness. I did this because I am undignified in God's sight. I am humbling myself, and I'll do so more often. He is rewarded there because when he says all the other maidens that Michal was worried about would not be a problem, they would hold him in honor. Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, if you know the culture back then, that was a condemnation. That was a condemnation because she made an issue of David dancing and worshiping before the Lord. Now, fast forward and go into Mark. Looking at Mark, we find the opposite of the spectrum. This was not worship. This was not even intended in any way, shape, or form to be holy. This was something that was intended to be enticing. It was the use of the female body, particularly in front of men, to entice them to evil thoughts. And it was very successful. If you'll notice, Philip had a wife, and then all of a sudden he didn't have one because Herod took her. And John the Immerser said, you can't do that. John just really didn't care whether you were a king or a pauper. He would tell you the truth. And so Herod put him in prison for that. Now, fast forward to a party they're having, and Herod's got all of his buddies, his big names there at his party, and Herodias' daughter, who was evidently a fetching creature, danced before them. Now, what kind of dance can you imagine that she would do in front of them that would cause him to lose his mind, his ever-loving mind, and promise to her half the kingdom? Which, by the way, I think she got cheated because she listened to Mama. I mean, she was in the money there. She'd been smart, but no, she listened to Mama. Mama was mad. Let's take John's head. And so that's what she asked for. But you'll notice that the surrounding things that went along with the characteristics and everything of this dance. It was something that would cause a king to make an outlandish promise. It was obviously something that was risque and was not proper for a young woman to do. I'm often reminded going back to Vashti in the Old Testament where Esther ended up being the replacement queen. When Vashti would not go in, when the king demanded that she come in and dance before everybody and show herself off, I can't imagine what that might have been like. But Vashti said, no, I ain't going to do it. And so she got rejected as queen, and Esther took her place. There's a lot of different takes on Vashti. I think she was quite noble in not doing what might have been a very sketchy environment for her to be in. And so here we find Herodias daughter doing exactly that thing. Salome, I think, is the one of the names that's given her. She danced before Herod and caused this stir that ended up costing John his life. How does that match with today's modern dance? When you look at some of the filthy gyrations that go on during the dance. By the way, and this is just something that our society has incorporated almost as the norm. You see things that probably 2 or 3 years ago at a football game, a Super Bowl game, when they did the halftime show, and some gal got naked. And there was a big brouhaha over it. And I was wondering myself, why? That goes on all over our culture. Why was it such a fuss back then in the public eye at a Super Bowl event when that goes on all the time in this culture? It's not that unusual. And if I thought myself, quite hypocritical of many in the culture to make such a fuss about something that goes on regularly. It's just that forum, that event was not the appropriate place for a woman to get naked. But they do it all the time in our culture. We have sexualized our culture to a disturbing degree. When you, Jean-Benet Renzi, and I mean, you just go on and on with examples of how we start our kids off, tiny kids, and put them in makeup and make them something they should never be even thinking about until they're much older and ready to get married. And yet, little tiny girls are made up like crazy. We have sexualized so much in our culture, and the danger is we get used to it. And when you get used to it, events or activities like dancing become, well, just not a big thing. And it ought to be. And I said this during the class when I taught it. I don't understand how the environment and music can change a situation where it's okay for you to get out in public and put your hands on another woman's body, men, who's not your wife, and it's okay because there's music going and it's in public. Why, any place else a man touch your wife like that, you'd beat him to a pulp. It would not be acceptable. And yet, if you put music to it, all of a sudden it's okay. Folks, we live in a culture that tolerates so many things that perhaps we have become numb to. And having become numb now, we accept it as just the way things are, when as Christians, we should not. We need to stand up for purity, holiness. I haven't actually had a preacher tell me, oh, that verse that says, be holy for I am holy, for God by inspiration is telling Christians what they should be. Oh, his dismissal of it was, well, we can't possibly be holy. We're humans and we're full of sin. So we can't even listen to that. It doesn't really apply to us. When it comes to a point where leaders in religious organizations are telling us, you can't possibly live up to the goal, you might as well not even try. We can't be holy. No, we can be holy. We can keep our minds right. And we keep our minds right, to steal a computer expression, by not allowing garbage in because garbage comes out. And we need to be that pure symbol in our culture, who, even though we're called names, crude, and all these other kinds of names people will call you, we just don't do some things. I know that everybody in town's doing it, that's fine. But we don't do those things. It's the case of the lemmings. If all the lemmings are dropping off a cliff, are you going to jump off a cliff? My mom used to throw them at me. And of course, I didn't want to be a dumb lemming, so I said, no, I won't do that. Well, then sometimes you have to go against what culture says and stand up and say, no, this is not an appropriate activity for Christians to invite. We just don't do that. And in doing so, we do make ourselves different, but we are a peculiar people, a different people, because we stand for what's holy and good. Because our culture decides to accept things that are not correct, in fact, to the degree of perverseness, things that God calls an abomination in the Bible, does not mean we should be neglectful, indifferent about it, just, oh, it's just the way things are. No, we should stand up against those kinds of things. And the modern dance is one of them. You see two examples of that kind of thing, and you can't use either one of them to say, this is something that a Christian ought to be involved in. And we don't dance to our worship, like they did in the Old Testament. We don't dance lasciviously in the New Testament, because we're Christians. We're different. This didn't accommodate an invitation. I knew this was going to be a difficulty, but hey, if you want to be holy and you want to be pure, it calls for living life purely, or living life right. If there's anything that anyone needs in a public way, we've got elders here who would be more than happy to pray, and we'll pray with them as we try to help you get your life back on track if you're off track. And that's what the invitation is for. Help us to get back on track. If you'd like to respond, won't you do so as we stand together and we sing.